If you'd like, you can navigate to this URL and have the slides available, because usually when I come to these type of events, projectors kind of fail you. So if you want to download that, there's the link. I'll leave it up for another few seconds. So. All right, so if everybody's good. All right, so a few things I want to mention before we get started. The DoubleTree in Austin here is run by Satan themselves. They'll sell your room without telling you. You'll be woken up at all hours of the evening. If you do manage to get a room, so some of those are more suggestions than. Yeah. We came in yesterday, 3 of us came in and they'd sold our rooms. They didn't even tell us, so things got interesting. Those that actually did have a room were woken up at 5 a.m., so yeah, with a fire alarm, so anyways.
Always your 9 to 5 rooms. Did you set the fire?
Yeah, who knows, right? There are a lot of questions. A lot of unanswered questions. Where do rooms go? Yeah, so about this presentation. It's for your benefit. That's why I'm here. So let's keep it interactive. If you want to ask questions, let's not do QA at the end. Stop me. We'll cover it right then and there. I have like 150 slides. So what I'm going to try to do is give you some broad overview of some of the things I'm talking about, and then dig down where applicable and stay out of that when not. So CTO of Invisium, they covered that. Things I like to talk about are dev. I don't know if any of you have seen some of the DevOps stuff I've talked about before. I really like breaking into DevOps tooling. That's really fun. Wrote Rails Goat, and obviously I'm into AWS security. All right, so I'm the CTO of a security company that comes with its own challenges, but then using AWS and being responsible for the security of that infrastructure, a whole other set of challenges, right? Things are changing pretty quickly, pretty often, and I'm responsible for keeping that secure. So what I have come across from other security teams is a situation, and stop me if this sounds familiar, basically you've got developers who are saying, hey, we want to push into AWS. And security doesn't necessarily have that AWS background or AWS security experience, and is trying to catch up. Or maybe you have a little bit of experience, but still a challenge for you, and still that's something that's new. So I figure give you some of the practical lessons I learned, maybe that will help you. All right, so high level, we want to prevent bad stuff from happening, alert ourselves if it's happening, and then recover from it, if the worst case does happen. So basically, the practical plan consists of hardening the environment so it's hard to get to, monitoring for changes that are security impacting, monitoring for people trying to attack you, and then being able to restore from an actual attack. So if you have not taken it, have not seen it, AWS does a great job of offering different CBTs. This one's free, and it's a security fundamentals course. I really recommend it. It covers a lot of things at a high level, and some a little bit lower level, so it's pretty good. But they give you their security plan, and a lot of what I talk about falls in line with their security plan. So nice to see the practicality matches up with AWS's security course. All right, so things that we're not going to talk about, S3 bucket policies, SSH security groups, and SSH keys and things of that nature. That's not really what I want to get into. Not saying they don't have a place, but there's tons of checklists and there's tons of resources out there, and this is really kind of low-hanging fruit. And speaking of that, Trusted Advisor will help you detect those low-hanging fruit issues, so I really recommend and urge you to use it. And there are 2 checklists which I believe are fairly important that everybody should be kind of following along with in their AWS environment. Those are the operational checklist and the security auditing checklist, offered by Amazon and updated periodically. And as I said, there's a security fundamentals course, it's free CBT. So we're not going to cover the basics. Those are some of the things that you probably already know, we are going to cover hardening, monitoring, and recovery. Just pause to take a sip of water. How'd that get up there? All right, so IAM hardening basics, making it difficult to reach our environment. All right, so number one, don't use the root account for operational purposes. We're going to talk about some of the things you can do with the root account to secure it. Auditing your IAM user policies. We're going to talk about multi-factor authentication and some other things. So the root account, every AWS organization, every AWS environment has a root account. We all know this. Only use it when you absolutely have to use it, though. There are only certain situations in which the root account is actually required. For most operational tasks, root account's not required. And there's a reason for this. When we go through setting up alerts, we want to know that the root account has been used. The root account has been used. And so you want to tell your developers, or you want to tell your team rather, ahead of time, hey, we're going to have to use the root account for this specific reason. And if nobody tells you that, hey, the root account's going to be used, and you get an alert that it has been used, you know to freak out. At least that's my approach. So removing, this is pretty basic. Remove the access keys, but one thing I don't mention here is also enable MFA on the root account. That's a no-brainer, and I'll give you some more information on that when we talk about MFA, multi-factor authentication. Okay, so IAM user permissions. This is I really find this to be super complex in the sense that, okay, so each user has a managed policy and they have inline policies. Sorry, I shouldn't say it in a singular form, I should say plural form. So every user has, they can have managed policies, inline policies. They can belong to groups that also have additional managed policies and inline policies. And if ever you had to audit this in a real organization using AWS, it can become this web of complexity, and you don't actually know what people have access to, and obviously that's a problem. And to briefly describe, managed policies are policies that can be attached to multiple users, groups, roles, whereas inline policies are attached only to one user, group, or role. I wrote some code. It's not the most beautiful code. I mean, I'm not sitting here saying I'm proud of it, but it does do the job. It'll create a CSV file that actually maps out a username in AWS to managed policies to inline policies and then the groups that they belong to. It's up on GitHub, and this is what it looks like. So it gives you these 4 columns, as I said. This is zooming in. Now this is scrubbed, sanitized data from a real client, and you can see how many different things are in this one inline policy for this one user. So it's a little bit of a catastrophe. So why are IAM user policies important? So if you're an organization that houses sensitive data in IAM and you have to actually audit who has access to what, they may have more access than you realize, right? I've seen basically a situation where there were some encrypted volumes and some encrypted instances, there were instances that had encrypted volumes that had limited access. Problem is, there were snapshots taken of those, unencrypted volumes that should have been encrypted. And those unencrypted volume snapshots were taken. And the problem is that anybody with EC2 access can spin up an EC2 instance and attach an unencrypted volume. When you encrypt the volume, however, you have this KMS setup within AWS, which means to access the key used to encrypt that volume, you actually have to be explicitly allowed to do that as a user. So having sensitive data, knowing who has access to what, super important. You need to audit that pretty frequently. What I will say is, no, go ahead.
Yeah, something that's worth mentioning. There's a tool that I use called Scout 2 that allows you to view a lot of that the IAM policy stuff all in line. Mm-hmm. That's really nice. So it'll have all the inline policies, the managed policies, and the users, and what all of the assets that hang off of their stuff all in a visual format. Looks like a nice HTML doc.
Yeah.
And I've used it to give my bosses and be like, hey, look, everybody's got too much shit.
Too much access. Yeah, and actually that's mentioned in the incident response. It's like one of the very last slides, but I'm glad you brought it up because yeah, there's my code, by the way, it's not super pretty, but that output is, and also SecurityMonkey has great change management tracking, and it's open source by Netflix.
There's something called the AWS well-architected framework, which is a lot of what the security aspect of it is a lot of what you're talking about as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's published by them as you should be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So worth looking at if you're trying to follow a standard.
Yep. Okay, so did everybody hear that? AWS has a framework, what's it called?
The well-architected framework.
The well-architected framework that you should look up and talks a bit about some of the stuff that we're covering. Okay, so AWS is a flexible environment as well, so as that changes, you obviously, as new things get spun up, you need to know who has access. So it's just a good idea to know who has access to what. When we talk about multi-factor authentication, for some of you this is super simple, you already know how to do this. For those that don't, multi-factor authentication is essentially two-factor authentication. If your credentials are guessed or stolen, this protects you as any two-factor authentication piece would. You can use Google Authenticator, Gemalto hardware, Google Authenticator being one version of like the virtual device, and Gemalto being the like hardware device for two-factor auth. Put a full list in here. So we're going to demonstrate enabling MFA real quick on an IAM account. For one single account, you go down to security credentials, you click manage MFA device, click on choose the type of device, virtual or hardware. If you've done a virtual device, take a picture with your phone of the QR code and type in your authentication code. You're good to go. So one problem, though, is that unless you have the IAM permissions, you won't actually be allowed to do this, right? Unless you're an administrator or you have those IAM permissions, you're kind of out of luck. So here's a policy that can actually fix that. So got a link in here for that, and this will allow a user to manage their own MFA device. Now, back to multi-factor authentication for root. You can use TOTP. TOTP protocol is essentially what they use to generate those MFA tokens, or can be shared as well in like LastPass and 1Password. And I like 1Password, so. All right, so API and MFA. Multi-factor authentication is typically thought of for the web console, but what a lot of people don't realize is that you can actually put multi-factor authentication onto the API. The API being what's used when you don't need to log in the web console and you want to automate tasks, which usually means you want to write some code that does something. And we all know keys never get stored in source code, so should be fine. What happens if keys do get disclosed? Anybody heard of code spaces? 1, 2, nobody else. That makes sense. They closed down because somebody stole their secret keys, burned down their AWS environment, and then that was it for them. They just went out of business. Granted, though, that's not usually what happens in the worst case scenario. What usually happens is somebody wakes up and they're like, we got $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 in expenses that now we're culpable for or liable for because we didn't do anything to secure our AWS environment. That's the most likely situation. So let's talk about, and by the way, you will notice I mentioned that you're financially responsible. Later I'll show you a thread that talks a little bit, I'll give you a link to a thread that talks a little bit about that and why you're financially responsible or could be. So, all right, so basically enforce, so we're talking about enforcing MFA. This actually enforces MFA, the policy I'm about to show you, on whoever has this policy attached to their account. So this will require, you'll see this line right here. It says condition Boolean, multi-factor authentication present. When that's on a policy and then attached to a group or user, whatever the case is, they have to use multi-factor authentication for the web and the API. But it's kind of a pain. It kind of causes problems. So really be careful of where you want to actually, or who you want to attach this to, that's for sure. But you can use STS. I'll give you some code that actually, here's a gist. So I'll give you some code and walk you through it real quick. It's just a proof of concept. Obviously, you're not going to use this every day for operational purposes, but it does explain how STS works with MFA. So essentially, I've got this screenshot of code, and you put in your access key ID, you put in your access key secret, the serial number of your MFA device, and the MFA code, so your Google Authenticator code or whatever you're using. And then when you run this for 3,600 seconds, this is going to be the credentials you get back will be valid, right? So what you get back when you run this script is a new access key ID, a new access secret, and a session token. And it's, again, pretty much available for you all day to use. And you can obviously change the duration of how long those temporary credentials are actually good for. This is an example of using it. This is a EC2 API tools that AWS put out, passing in a few options. We actually get a response back, so we know STS does work with MFA. And if you don't like Ruby, you can use Python, or Python and Bash, I think, is a combination. STS does not work with Elastic Beanstalk. So if you are using Elastic Beanstalk, the answer would be to use Code Pipeline. And that pulls from AWS's S3, from Code Commit, and then also from GitHub. And then, yeah, I'm not going to cover that. So password policy, real quickly. Password policies should have some level of complexity. I've seen orgs with no password policies. Here's an example password policy. Don't want to spend all the time in the world on it, but it is still something to mention. So again, make credentials hard to guess, make them hard to use if they are stolen, and protect your king, which is a root. So this is like sort of the more fun for me section. All right, so assuming prevention has failed. So like, let's say an access key of Abdullah here is stolen. Abdullah's the guy I work with, and I'm putting him on the spot. So let's say your access key is stolen. I want to know that if somebody's using those keys to do something bad inside the environment, I want to know about it, right? So there are 4 services we're going to talk about, and then we're going to show some integration and some different things. So one thing to mention is some of the things I'm going to show you have a lot of noise. So when we get to Lambda, that should help you avoid some of that noise by pinpointing what you want to actually hear. Okay, so CloudTrail, that's essentially logs. It's where you store your logs. SNS is used for sending notifications. That's a messaging service. Config, that's like that pretty much tells you what is changing, what has changed, and it does that for every resource if you'd like it to inside of AWS. And then there's CloudWatch, which is for very pinpointed, fine-grained alerting. Okay, so at a high level, it's sort of all of these services feeding down into CloudTrail, logs being stored, and then that information being parsed to actually provide you with some notifications. What we're really going to focus on is taking with config and CloudWatch from those CloudTrail logs, pushing to SNS, which will send you notifications. So CloudTrail. Basically, to use it, you just turn it on. You give it a name, you walk through a few steps, configure a log group, allow creation of the IAM role that happens automatically, and you've got CloudTrail enabled. Really that easy. It's probably one of the easiest things in AWS to actually do. So SNS. Now, when we talk about SNS, there are a few ways that you can be notified. There's actually more than a few ways, but my favorite ways are SMS, email, and now Lambda, which I really do like the fact that we can push to Lambda with SNS. And then if you want to post your own application, JSON's available, JSON requests. You can receive, so basically when you've got really important things happening in your environment, when things that you should be really worried about are happening, this will have the ability to alert you in real time that something's going wrong, like if you want a text message. So in order to create a topic inside of, so a topic is something that you subscribe to. A topic is, hey, root account usage. The root account's being used. So I'm going to create this topic, and then I'm going to subscribe to it. So basically, you can have multiple subscribers for one topic. So you can have like your VP of engineering or your head of security or whatever subscribe to a topic, and they'll know that root account's being used in this case. Picture of SMS, email. All right, so config. We're moving on to config. I'm kind of having a burn through here. So Config is, like I said, a tool that just tracks anything that at all is changing based off of what it sees in CloudTrail. It's really nice for compliance purposes, for incident response. What I can say is that there are these prepackaged rules, and that list started at like 7, and now it's growing. And the ones I wanted to point out that I actually think are really interesting is config will let you know if like root account MFA is no longer enabled, or if it becomes if there's any change in the root account having MFA attached to it, you'll know about it. I think it's really cool that, you know, RDS, those databases, right, MySQL, Postgres, taken care of by AWS, a service-hosted service where AWS hosts that for you. If encryption is no longer turned on, it'll let you know. I think that's really cool. But that list is available here, and you can see how it's growing. You can see what other prepackaged rules you can choose from. So things that you can be really explicit about, any changes in a firewall, security group, any changes in the VPC, or anything at all. So this is me saying, hey, I want to know about changes in the network ACL and in the VPC. But when I get to this other option, I say, no, I want to know about everything. If anything at all changes, and this is super noisy, if anything changes, let me know about it. I started with this and then had to sort of refine it from there, because that you get a lot of notifications. So these steps, again, you can go back through the slides, but we're going to create a bucket, assign it to an SNS topic, allow the role to be created, and that is the gist with CloudWatch, or sorry, config. Now CloudWatch, this is where it gets fine-grained. We're going to talk about, so the few things we're talking about are putting alarms on like root account usage. We're going to put an alarm on unauthorized activity, failed logins, and then we're going to show integration of Slack and Lambda. All right, so we can be very particular about what we want to see. These are the 4 alerts we're going to walk through. Let's go right to billing alarm. So why do you care about a billing alarm? If you start spending a lot of money and your organization, let's say your limit per month, you usually spend $1,500, and all of a sudden you're spending $30,000. Clearly something's up. I mean, even if it's not a security issue, you obviously need to know about this. So this is a very basic minimum alarm you should have. So you'd navigate to billing and alerts. You'd enable your account to receive billing alerts. You go in and you create a SNS topic, call it billing alert, subscribe to the topic. Now, this part I always like to be very clear about. On the left, you see I've highlighted metrics. There are 2 ways that you primarily build these CloudWatch alarms. Logs are CloudTrail logs. They're CloudTrail streams, log streams, and that's where you want to actually put in a filter, or it's almost like a regular expression where you say, hey, I want to be looking for these specific things, pull them out of the logs, grok it, send a notification off when that thing happens. Metrics, on the other hand, are predetermined values that you are going to configure some thresholds on, and we'll show that. So when we click on metrics, we can go to billing, we can go and choose the currency. This is US dollars. We can go in and say, hey, if our spend goes above $1,600, cool, create an alarm. And the exact steps on all of this can be found here. But again, this is sort of the threshold metric portion of what I was talking about. Root login. All right. So I'm going to tell you real quick how it works in my organization. If you log in my organization and you've not told somebody that you're going to use the root account, and you might have a valid reason for it, but if you've not told anybody, we all go into panic mode. We know the limited amount of people that actually have access to that account, and yeah, you have to respond, because we'll keep trying you to make sure that it is actually you, and we start to go into like IR mode if after a couple minutes, if we're not hearing from someone. So this isn't necessarily like a policy we put together, but when we enabled this alert, this is sort of a byproduct and behavior of what came out of that. So to actually enable this, you want to go to the log section on the left instead of the metrics. Choose your actual CloudTrail log. Go in, put in the filter pattern that makes sense to you. It's very hard to see on this, and I apologize for that. But essentially, it's like this big, long, regex looking string. A little bit easier to see here. So you'll go in, there's really, all of this is very, very straightforward. You give it a metric namespace, a metric name, and a filter name, right? Then after that's done, you go and you create an alarm, go in, and basically what I'm going to say here is that if somebody logs in with the root account more than once within a 5-minute period, trigger this alarm. And when this alarm goes off, it hits SNS, SNS hits us. So this is really immediate. So the exact steps, again, I've kept the links to all of this inside the presentation. Failed logins. So this is really when someone's either fat fingering their password or they're actually trying to guess credentials. These steps are pretty much the same as the root login. In fact, I'm not going to waste your time by covering those over and over and over again. The filter pattern, however, is different. And so the filter just basically says, hey, if somebody is trying to log in through the console and there's a failed login, then alert us. And exact steps, once again, here. Okay, so at AppSec USA, Chris Gates and I talked about essentially DevOps. The talk was called DevOps Redux, right? So we talked about a lot of fixes for insecurity and DevOps tooling. But we also kind of talked a little bit about attacking. And one of the tools that Chris wrote was an AWS interrogate tool. Essentially, he found tons and tons and tons of access keys out there on the internet. And so what he did is he built a little Python tool that allowed him to, and it's out there on GitHub, put in the secret key and you can sort of enumerate what each user has access to. So while he was building that, I was like, well, what can we do to actually alert pretty fairly instantaneously about the fact that you're doing that? So that's what this alarm is actually about. That's why it came about. It alerts us to when somebody's trying that. Steps are pretty much, like I said, exactly the same as root login and failed logins. Filter pattern is different. As always, I keep a slide in here. I keep a link in these slides to how to do this. But this is interesting to me. Running the AWS interrogate enumeration tool, you get back some information about, hey, this was possible, this wasn't possible with this user account, but I get, and my team gets an email, and this was us running the tool and us waiting for the response from AWS to tell us, hey, something bad's going on. So we got an email that tells us, hey, something bad's going on. We have the ability to see what IAM user ID it is in numeric form. Wish it was username. But yeah, it's a numeric form, so you have to kind of trace that back. But again, instantaneously, we know someone's trying to do something pretty bad, which makes me sleep better at night. And yeah, it's very nice. So what I am going to talk about next, though, is actually doing this with Lambda and Slack. Okay, so however, if you want to build your own alarms, because this is just a starting point, this link will give you the filters set so you can go through and build your own alarms. Okay, so Lambda and Slack. I'm going to talk about this at a high level real quick. So what really happens is you are going to go first into, you're going to go into Lambda. You're going to create a function, and that function is going to use a blueprint. A blueprint is a template of code that's already written for you. There's already a Slack and CloudWatch blueprint in there. So all you really have to do is you'll go in there, and you can see it here. You'll go in there, you'll choose the CloudWatch Slack alarm, and then you'll proceed through the following steps. So you're going to have to go into KMS and create KMS being AWS's encryption key management service. You'll create a key, a KMS key. You'll say, here are the people that are allowed to administer that key. You'll use that key to create, so you'll go to Slack and you'll say, hey, I want to use the incoming webhooks tool, and we'll walk through all this, but it'll say, okay, well, if you want an incoming webhook that's going to send a message to some Slack channel, then here's the URL that you should use. So what you do is you go in with KMS, that key that you just created, and you say, okay, I'm going to encrypt this URL Slack gave me. It's going to come back base64 encoded. I'm going to put that into this blueprint, this already written up code, and then that code, whenever the alarm gets triggered, whatever alarm I've chosen, which in our case is going to be unauthorized access attempts, then I'll push that over to Slack using the encrypted URL, encrypted base64 encoded URL that you've given me. All right, so like I said, choose your blueprint. Go in and configure a trigger. In this case, it's going to be SNS to Lambda. I'm going to choose my SNS topic, which is unauthorized access attempts. I'm going to get my blueprint, my set of code that's already pre-written for me. Go over to Slack, choose incoming webhooks, add a configuration, choose the room that you want to send it to. You can do things like, you can also on this page like put a picture associated with the bot that's going in there, or you can change the name, you can do things like that. And then you can grab the webhook URL, go into KMS inside of AWS, create a key, give it an alias. In this case, it was Slack alerts. Okay, now this is using the AWS KMS encrypt tool. Notice I ate my own dog food, and well, maybe you can't notice, but for the profile, for the credentials profile, I used STS to actually run this. So I actually did what I'm recommending here and had a temporary set of credentials to run this KMS encrypt with encrypting the Slack webhook URL command. So I get back this ciphertext blob. That blob is what I want to use and put inside of this code right here. This is the actual Lambda code. It says it's got encrypted encoded URL or encrypted encoded URL and Slack channel. So you put those two options in, and that's it. You're good at that point to go. So the result is in Slack, I mean, there's a few other steps, but if you just follow along through everything I just showed you, it's very simple. This is a Slack alert, and it just basically says, and I didn't get very descriptive here, there's really no reason to. This is like the basic templated alarm that comes with it. You can get a little bit more specific on like who was doing that and more information that you might want. But anyways, there's a notification in Slack a couple minutes after I had tried to do something I wasn't supposed to do with a test account. So it works. All right, so now I'm going to move on to Splunk. Last parts of this are Splunk. I just want to quickly talk about that. Then we're going to talk about incident response and then recovery. And that'll be it. So, all right, so Splunk, I really like it. I'm sure y'all are using it. I like the Splunk app for AWS and Splunk add-on. The things it allows you to do. I'll show you some pictures, but you can see everything from IAM activity, SSH key pair activity, whatever it is you want to see. They've got a pretty graphic for it. It can even automate building your network topology, and I'll show you a screenshot for that as well. So, pretty screenshot one. This is your usage of your AWS environment. It's put together. It's really nice and pretty. This is the network topology diagram I was talking about. That's really nice. And then this is your billing information.
How much did you have to change the scripting to do this, and how much was out of the box for that?
Pretty much out of the box. There is a little bit of configuration from your side for AWS specifically. It's actually nothing to do with Splunk. But yeah, out of the box. You do have to have Splunk Enterprise, obviously, because if you don't have Splunk Enterprise, you can't install an app.
Where are you hosting Splunk?
I don't know. Where are you hosting Splunk?
Are you hosting Splunk in your own AWS infrastructure? Are you using Splunk?
We may or may not have multiple Splunk or multiple AWS environments. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Sorry, security conference. There's only so much I'll say. But that's a good point, though. I think what you're driving at is don't put Splunk inside of the environment you want to secure.
Right, and then, how do you deploy it? Because that's a lot of information through there.
Say that last part again?
The searching that you're doing
Uh-huh.
is what you pay for with Splunk in a lot of ways.
Right.
Yeah, so you're talking about creating a lot of searches that you're then going to depend on, and Splunk now has you hostage. So, how big a Splunk deployment is running in AWS, and how expensive is that is kind of what I was driving at.
Okay, not very expensive, and you can go with your, what's the smallest tier, like 1 gig a month? It's 10 gigabits? Yeah, so I think it's 1 gig for the lowest tiered paid for version, and you can get away with that. Or I think even the free version you'd probably be fine with. So it's actually not that, you're not really held. So by the way, everything you can do inside of Splunk, you can do inside of AWS. It's not necessarily held hostage, but sometimes like you know, it's just one place to go that maybe, or second place to go that you might like. I think it's the easy button, frankly, and it shows you so much without you having to do very much. So, and actually on that note, to create the account, so you create an account inside of AWS for Splunk. So Splunk can grab information, and basically there's a policy that you attach. It's specifically for the Splunk user, and yeah, attach to them. They'll attach to that Splunk user. They'll have the permission to grab what they need, and you go in and do configure. And you configure per service on how you want all this stuff to feed in. There's a little bit of extra work which I'm not talking about inside of AWS, which involves SQS and SNS to build that. Like, there's a few things it builds on top, but you don't. There's instructions with Splunk, the Splunk app to do all this, so it's not too complicated. And then, yeah, which is kind of what I'm kind of just drove at. So again, alert yourself when things change. Things will get noisy. Do instant alerting when necessary or when it makes sense. To this Cura thread. So this is like one of my favorite things to read about this topic because there's a few things to highlight. So one is everybody, if you go to this thread, you'll see everybody saying the same thing. Yes, my access keys were stolen or they were leaked. I ran up a huge bill with AWS over and over and over again. Another thing is that AWS apparently has a board where they can review your case. And if you've done nothing to harden your environment or you've been, you just haven't taken advantage of any of the things they offer to protect your account, you and your organization can be held legally liable for the costs that you've incurred. And then I think one thing we all in this room get, but whenever I'm talking to developers, I kind of just mention it, is that you know, there's bots out there scouring the web. His name's Chris Gates, and he's looking for your access keys and getting your environment. So, all right, so restoration and recovery. You should know this. These are some basic things, not necessarily AWS specific. Know who to contact, know the channels in which to communicate over, practice that, and know where to go to restore data and how to figure out, like, go back through logs and figure out what happened. So my one recommendation, talking about multiple AWS environments, is do not use the same AWS environment to back up your AWS environment. That'd be a huge mistake. A disaster, in fact. But what I have heard people are doing is creating a secondary or tertiary account using Glacier and S3 to move their backups over to that account. And that account is highly restricted to just a couple people or a few people. Maybe the security team, maybe the heads of the engineering organization, whatever the case is. So there are some resources for actually performing backups, but the problem is I can't give you a silver bullet. There's no product that I'd love to tell you about a product that somebody had built that is a silver bullet and backs everything up for you seamlessly, does it off-site or whatever the case is, but there's really nothing out there. So if anybody's looking for product ideas, there you go. And then in terms of incident response, I don't really want to talk about this in depth because back to Scout 2, Alex McCormick at DerbyCon and Andrew Krug had this awesome talk on incident response inside of AWS. There's a YouTube video, right? It's a really good talk. Kudos to them. So I really recommend you go and check out that talk. Everything you know about incident response within AWS, I think they'll cover at a fairly high level. Okay, presentation recap. I think we all know not to stay at the Hilton, the DoubleTree Hilton. Just my personal opinion. What's that?
They had free cookies.
They did have free cookies, probably laced with, I won't say anything more. Anyways, so real recap, make your environment harder to reach, limit access if somebody has stolen some credentials and has gotten in, have a plan for, obviously if things go wrong, And I hope also if you have questions and you don't really want to talk about it here, just I'm at the conference today and tomorrow. Just come up or after this or whatever, and we'll hopefully answer the question. I don't know. So that's my information. Thanks again. Appreciate it. Thanks.